Hello, my name is Daniela Palmieri, and today I'll be talking about Chapter 1, Section 3. The first person introduced in Chapter 1, Section 3 was Edward C. Tolman. Tolman was an early behaviorist who spent his career at the University of California. The approach started with Edward C. Tolman, and it was called Operational Behaviorism. Tolman described his perspective in several articles. However, one of the most important was a paper he published in 1938. His idea shows a series of empirical correlations that one can gather in the lab. For example, a rat's drinking increases if it is deprived of water, fed dry food, or injected with a salt solution. The relationship can be simplified using what Tolman called an intervening variable. Another term for an intervening variable is theoretical construct. In this scheme, the things we manipulate affect thirst, and thirst in return produces the behavioral effects described. Invoking thirst would have no use in explained behavior if we had no understanding of how it comes about and how it affects behavior. Using intervening variables can have some advantages. For example, it simplifies the picture by reducing the messy number of empirical SR correlations. It also suggests new hypotheses and relationships that stimulate new research. Another pioneer was using intervening variables. His name was Clark L. Hull. He presented a highly systematic theory of behavior that had a large impact in the 1940s and 1950s. Today, many of Hull's ideas have been disconfirmed. However, his theory still stands as a brilliant example of how theoretical constructs can be used. Two of Hull's hypothetical constructs were drive and habit. Drive was the motivation caused by biological need, such as thirst and hunger, and habit was learning. It was mostly influenced by the number of times the behavior had been reinforced. Based on empirical research, Hull concluded that drive and habit multiplied to influence performance. After World War II, there were further changes in how psychologists began to think about behavior. During the war, many psychologists helped design military equipment with an eye toward making it easy for people to operate. Psychologists began to think of people as processors of information. By the 1960s, it was becoming clear that computers could be programmed to solve problems and do other impressive tasks that humans can do. The basic computer receives input and eventually turns this information into output. If we were to see inside the machine, we would be able to see that the work being done is in a central processor that manipulates the codes and symbols in a sequence. The computer is the inspiration behind the information processing approach in cognitive psychology. The system receives sensory input from the external world, and this input is processed into different forms at different points in the sequence. The computer metaphor is still important in psychology, but it cannot really tell the whole story. There are a couple problems to this. One is that it has little to say about learning. Instead, it mainly tells us about symbol manipulation. Another problem is that although the standard model makes sense as a series of hypothetical constructs, it is not likely that the brain is really organized this way. Neurons in the brain operate in milliseconds, but the computer operates much faster in the range of nanoseconds. A new perspective began to emerge in the 1980s. It was called connectionism, but it is referred to as parallel distributed processing or neural networks. This perspective goes back to the brain metaphor. The idea is that cognition can be understood as a network of connections between units that look a little bit like neurons. As an example, a network like the one in Figure 1.15 can recognize dogs and cats and discriminate them from any other object. Each of the nodes is activated when a particular item is present in the environment. One node responds to ears, another node responds to a tongue, and so on. Networks like these have many advantages. For example, it is easy to see how they learn. After the connections have been learned, the net can respond to new dogs and discriminate them from cats. Overall, the connectionist approach is now largely represented in cognitive science. The computer and brain metaphors are also important in the learning theory, and it also has shown that they are really quite similar. Researchers also began to study cognitive topics in animals such as short-term memory, memory codes, spatial memory, and timing. This produces the question, what are the differences between the research literatures on human and animal learning? The first answer to that is that animal learning has kept its original interest in behavior. The second answer is that animal learning researchers are often still stingy about the number of theoretical constructs that they use. The biggest difference between human and animal learning and memory is the species that are studied. In animals, one can also study the effects of certain events or procedures that are harder to study in humans. One example would be studying how unpleasant emotions like fear are learned, or how strong hunger and other forms of motivation affect behavior and learning. Research with animals is regulated by law and by rigorous ethical principles. To conclude, the study of learning in animals is a method that allows scientists to study processes involved in learning and memory across species. Also, human learning and animal learning are complementary approaches to the same problem.